Hi, everybody. This is Mr. H, and we're going to be looking at this book, Let's Celebrate Election Day by Barbara deRubertis. And here we go. On Election Day, Americans vote for the people we want to govern our country. For over 200 years, we have come closer and closer to having universal suffrage. This means that almost all adults now have the right to become citizens and to vote. So I'm just going to pause here for a second. Suffrage means the right to vote. In this case, universal is talking about everybody. So universal suffrage means everybody having the right to vote. We work hard to make sure our elections are free, fair, honest, and open. But the American path toward universal suffrage has been a long and bumpy one. Timeline: expanding voting rights in America. In 1776, people in the 13 American colonies declared their independence. They wanted to choose their own leaders, so they fought for freedom from the King of England and won. The first federal election was completed in January 1789. States set their own rules for voting. In most states, only white, male, Protestant property owners over the age of 21 were allowed to vote. So only about 1% of the population actually voted. So back up here. So Protestant refers to a particular type of Christianity. So certain Christian denominations like Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian, there's a whole bunch of them, Amish, those are all Protestant versions of Christianity. On to the next page. Over time, the laws about who could vote began to change. By 1828, there were no more religious restrictions on voting. By 1856, all white men over 21 were allowed to vote, not just property owners. After the Civil War, all the slaves were freed. And in 1870, the right to vote was given to African American men. 2 African American men were elected as senators. But whites soon took actions that made it hard for both African Americans and poor whites to vote. People had to pay poll taxes before they could vote. Many did not have the money. So a poll is the place where you go for voting. So poll taxes are taxes paid so that you could go to vote. People had to take literacy tests. The tests were extremely difficult to pass. African Americans had to deal with threats of violence. These threats scared many away from voting. As a result, the number of African American men registered to vote in the South dropped to less than 6%. In 1920, American women finally won the right to vote when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed. Women had fought tirelessly for this right for 144 years. For a long time, Native Americans could not vote. They were forced to choose between being U.S. citizens and being members of their own tribes. But in 1924, all Native Americans were allowed to become U.S. citizens. Some states allowed them to vote, some did not. In 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. So exclusion means to leave people out of something. It's to not permit. So inclusion is where you are including people. Exclusion is when you exclude people. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. For over 60 years, Chinese laborers had been prevented from immigrating to the United States. Now they could immigrate, become citizens, and vote. In 1946, immigrants from India were allowed to become citizens and vote. By 1947, all the states had granted the right to vote to Native Americans. In 1952, Japanese Americans who were born in the U.S. were allowed to become citizens and vote. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s caused huge changes in U.S. voting laws. African Americans had the right to vote, but too often were not allowed to use that right. A turning point came in 1965. Hundreds of people gathered in Alabama to march from Selma to Montgomery. They were protesting how difficult it was for African Americans to register to vote. So just going to point out, Selma is a city in Alabama. Montgomery is the capital. And to go from Selma to Montgomery is a little over 50 miles. The first two attempts at the march were met with police violence. So the president sent in National Guard troops to protect the marchers. The third attempt was successful. By then, 25,000 people had joined the 50-mile march. The result of the protest was that Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. It no longer allowed unfair practices that kept African Americans or poor whites from registering or voting. In 1971, the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18. This happened because of the Vietnam War. Supporters said that if people were old enough to fight, they are old enough to vote. In 1975, Congress expanded the Voting Rights Act. Voting information would now be translated into Spanish and other languages for those who needed help reading English. As a result, more Americans were able to vote. But voting rights have not always been expanded. Sometimes they have been restricted. This happened in 2000 to the residents of Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. A federal court ruled that the 4 million people living in U.S. colonies cannot vote in presidential elections even though they are U.S. citizens. Today, Americans are still working to make sure that everyone who has the right to vote is registered and can actually use that right. Preparing to vote. Voting is a privilege, but it is also a big responsibility. We protect our freedoms in America by trying to elect wise and honest leaders. We also protect our freedoms by voting on issues, small and large, from building a new school to changing the Constitution. Before we vote, we can learn about the people and the issues on the ballot. We can learn about the political parties, their candidates, and their platforms or ideas for improving our government. We can read newspapers and voting guides, and we can watch news programs and debates. We can talk with people whose opinions are like our own, and with those whose opinions are different. We can think about how our votes will affect us and our fellow Americans. Registering to vote. Before we vote for the first time, we must register. In more and more states, registration is automatic when we get a driver's license or ID card. In North Dakota, people don't have to register at all. They just bring their IDs and vote. In other states, we still must register in person, by mail, or online. We first need to show an ID card. Then we fill out a form. This usually must be done well ahead of the election. When are elections held? General Election Day is held in even-numbered years. It is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. We have a presidential election every 4 years. In between those years, also in even-numbered years, we have midterm elections. Those elections are very important too. Even though we don't vote for a president, we vote for many other leaders and issues.